1938 when Frank Lloyd Wright appeared on the cover of Time magazine. He was not only the first architect to appear on the cover of Time, he was the first artist in general to appear on the cover of Time. And keep your eyes open to the project that's in the background of his cover. He was nearing 70 years old, and it was really against all odds that he would have the seemingly miraculous mid-1930s reappearance. As a quick review of where we've come from, Frank Lloyd Wright is born in Wisconsin. He practices in Chicago. He establishes the prairie style. He invents this new modern architecture. But last week, between 1914 and 1930, Wright had lost the love of his life and his home to a horrific murder arson. He'd gotten catastrophically involved with a mentally unwell morphine addict. He had built the Imperial Hotel in Tokyo. He had conceived a child out of wedlock. He had suffered his home, Taliesin, burning down a second time. And then he had suffered the indignity of having the Bank of Wisconsin foreclose on his house and even his cattle. He had lost his Liebermaster, Louis Sullivan, and he had experimented successfully in textile block construction in Los Angeles, married a third and final time to Olgivanna, who was 30 years his younger, and he'd also reacquired his house. He'd written his autobiography, and he's sort of ready for his next act. He's gone very down, he's on the way back up, and it's only up from here. So looking at tonight, the sort of linchpin in the transformation of Frank Lloyd Wright is at the top left. Falling Water was the iconic work of Frank Lloyd Wright's rise to the status of a cultural hero. It also signaled his return to the forefront of modern architecture more broadly, and Falling Water will be the subject of our fifth and final lecture. But you really can't understand Frank Lloyd Wright's second half of his career without going in at least a little bit towards Falling Water. Tonight, we'll be looking at his institutions, including the S.C. Johnson Wax Company Administration Building and, of course, the Guggenheim, but also the way that Frank Lloyd Wright transformed his practice from a more conventional architecture firm with an architect at the top and architects underneath to one of a school with architect and apprentices. But this sort of rebirth of Frank Lloyd Wright is happening at the same time of an international depression. And so in 1930, Frank Lloyd Wright isn't building buildings because no architect is building buildings. As the Great Depression sort of rears its ugly head and causes the collapse of the stock market and the architectural industry, Wright spent his time writing and lecturing, and generally preparing for better economic times. He completed the Kahn lectures at Princeton and turned that series from May of 1930 into a book, Modern Architecture of 1931, for which Wright designed this rather beautiful sort of desert cover. He published his autobiography in 1932, and then The Disappearing City, also in 1932, which was his first meditation on city planning and particularly American city planning, which, as Wright perceptively notes, is suburban planning. He's really the first architect to seriously consider the suburb. While he's doing all of this, his major publications, Frank Lloyd Wright is also churning out articles, more than 30 between 1930 and 1935. And he wasn't just writing to professional and trade journals, he was writing to the popular press, House Beautiful, Ladies' Home Journal, the New York Times Magazine. So he's really expanding his reach as an architectural theorist and educator. He's also turning one of his lectures from the Art Institute of Chicago into a traveling exhibit. He published 2 lectures in architecture in 1931, and then traveled the show from New York to Amsterdam, Berlin, Frankfurt, Stuttgart, Antwerp, Brussels, and then around the United States for about 3 years. And here you can see students in Amsterdam moving Frank Lloyd Wright's models around from show to show. And Wright and Olgivanna were going with the models and the show, pinning up the drawings. So he is back in Europe. He is back proselytizing himself to an architectural community that's quite different from the one he had gone to in 1910 with Mema Borthwick. There, he was sort of a new architect, a young man, famed for his Chicago projects. 1930, what is Frank Lloyd Wright famous for? Well, the model that they're carrying, St. Mark's in the Bowery, is a proposal for a very unique skyscraper, but like all of Wright's 1920s projects, had never been built. So he's advertising himself, but without sort of the buildings that he had in 1910. He's also doing a lot of observing. He's writing, he's listening, he's seeing, and he's traveling more broadly. He visits Rio de Janeiro for the first time in 1931 with his close friend, Eliel Saarinen. And Frank Lloyd Wright, Olgivanna Wright, Eliel Saarinen, and Loya Saarinen travel down to South America to be judges for a proposed Christopher Columbus Memorial Lighthouse. While the Saarinen sort of stayed in their hotel and dutifully went to the different government events and the different architectural societies, Frank Lloyd Wright was out causing literal riots among the architecture students. He compelled them to rally up against the professors and the French Beaux-Arts method and demand a new architecture for Brazil. He also observed the sort of unique South American landscape, including this postcard that Frank Lloyd Wright purchased and sent back to Darwin Martin in Buffalo, showing the famous 18th century aqueduct cutting across the landscape. It was really in this time period, 1930, 1931, that Frank Lloyd Wright and Olgivanna became a much more stable force and a much more dynamic duo. They begin to think, how are we going to shape the next part of our lives together, not just the sole genius, but as a team? And they begin to think of the property in Wisconsin as a school. Now, this is something that Frank Lloyd Wright had conceived of first in 1928, when he proposes converting his aunt's school, which was a sort of a reform, unique school for children. It had to close because of the various Wright scandals. No one would send their kids this close to the scandalous Mr. Frank Lloyd Wright. And he wants to change it to the Hillside Home School for the Allied Arts, where not only would he teach architecture, but there would be craft and studio workshops for sculpture, painting, mosaic, jewelry making, and ironwork, as well as a theater for drama, stage design, cinema, and music. And this is really a quite elaborate scheme that Frank Lloyd Wright has come up with. He must have been thinking about the different arts and crafts societies he had seen in London, including his friend C.R. Ashby's Guild of Handicrafts that he would have visited in Chipping Camden when he visited Ashby in 1910. And these were rather medievalizing societies that made quite historicist little products. You know, basically everything since the Renaissance was horrible, so let us go back in time to the Gothic and find this new art form celebrating truth and beauty in the individual object. Frank Lloyd Wright wasn't that sort of pedantic. He, of course, had given the great lecture at the turn of the century at the Art Institute called Arts, Crafts, and the Machine. So he's thinking, I'm sure, of Ashby and his guild, but he's also thinking of the Bauhaus, which was the German recreation of a arts and crafts school in Weimar, renamed 1919 by Walter Gropius as the Bauhaus, which combined sort of mechanization and standardization with the handmade. Famously, the Bauhaus never actually taught architecture under Gropius. It was always in the cards, never actually came to fruition. So instead, what you had was an architect, Walter Gropius, who's incredibly theoretical, incredibly influential, and he's essentially leading a complete reform on arts education. He is doing away with the idea of sort of copying old masters in the gallery or of creating a grand partie and executing beautiful watercolors. Instead, the Bauhaus is focused on shape, form, space, movement, very abstract concepts that do result in products. And so the Bauhaus has its famous workshops of stained glass and metalsmithing, weaving. And we don't know if Frank Lloyd Wright ever visits the Bauhaus. He does know Walter and Isa Gropius. But I'm not sure that the Bauhaus would have been an appropriate model for Taliesin out in the countryside. Dessau was a manufacturing town. They're next to a bicycle factory. Instead, what Frank Lloyd Wright does visit and what he says is the explicit inspiration of his hillside home of allied craft, or the Taliesin Fellowship, is Cranbrook. And so we know that Frank Lloyd Wright and Eliel Saarinen meet each other in 1923. They are friendly by the 1920s. They are really sort of best frenemies by the 1930s. And it is Cranbrook that inspires the entire Taliesin project. I say as the curator at Cranbrook. That's a debatable statement. But Cranbrook is a model that most clearly shows Wright's vision, where you have at the center the architect Eliel Saarinen, a Finnish immigrant, who is teaching architecture, teaching town planning as the mother art. And so all of the allied arts are underneath architecture, and they're all collaborating together. For instance, Ralph Rapson, an architecture student, here designing pots and pans. And at Cranbrook, Taliesin would never achieve this, but here Eliel Saarinen is able to go from 1928, a series of commercial workshops of silversmith, blacksmith, weaver, bookbinder, printing press, to by 1932 having painting, sculpture, and architecture, combining fine art and the craft in this sort of unique community where everyone is collaborating together across disciplines, across medium. And Frank Lloyd Wright was here. He visited on multiple occasions. He critiqued Cranbrook on many occasions. He said that Cranbrook was a great demonstration of our founder, George Booth's lack of confidence in American art, because who was at the head but a fairly distinguished Finnish architect who were head of each department, almost all Finns, Swedes, Austro-Hungarians. You know, it's an immigrant community at Cranbrook with virtually no American educators. And so Frank Lloyd Wright critiques the whole enterprise while being very jealous of the whole enterprise. And so when Frank Lloyd Wright would come to campus, it was a celebrity moment. Here we see Frank Lloyd Wright, Eliel, and Eero Saarinen about 1935, standing outside of Carl Millis's studio. And we know that Richard Rossman, the executive secretary, would often tell Eliel Saarinen, why don't we have Frank Lloyd Wright come back for a lecture? Those always sell out. So there's even a sort of economic desire of having Frank Lloyd Wright come and grant the Cranbrook community a luster. But it went both ways. In August of 1932, Frank Lloyd Wright wrote to Saarinen and asked for a letter of support for the Taliesin Fellowship because he felt that industry and the sponsors that Frank Lloyd Wright wanted to support Taliesin would be afraid of such a radical architect as Frank Lloyd Wright. And so he wanted Eliel Saarinen to give this sort of veneer of respectability, of institutional approval to the Frank Lloyd Wright venture. Wright also wrote to such esteemed architects as Bucky Fuller, Albert Kahn, Joseph Urban, as well as sort of older architects like John Hollibird and John Welburn Root. And so Frank Lloyd Wright is writing to the establishment and saying, don't you think my school is going to be wonderful? Won't you support it? He's also coming to Cranbrook and poaching our students who come back to Taliesin. At the same time, many of our earliest architecture students were Frank Lloyd Wright apprentices that came to Bloomfield Hills. So we're intimately connected across the two schools. Of course, the great difference is on the left, you have behind the Cranbrook project, the Detroit Evening News fortune of Ellen Scripps and George Booth. On the right, you have no money, you have nothing. Frank Lloyd Wright can't get a mortgage, he can't get a loan. And so his ambitious and unaffordable plan is extremely scaled back. And in 1932 opens with just 23 apprentices and virtually no buildings. Frank Lloyd Wright charges his students, his apprentices, tuition, and then he makes them build the school. They build a large drafting room, 16 apprentice rooms. They convert a gymnasium into a playhouse theater. They repair and add on to the dilapidated hillside home school buildings. Since there were no actual projects in the Frank Lloyd Wright architecture studio, they would instead make drawings for the expansion of the Taliesin compound. They would make speculative drawings, and they would farm. They would grow their own food. They would cook. They would clean. They would perform. Frank Lloyd Wright said, there will be no armchair architects here. He also probably should have said, like, there'll be no labor practices here, because it was a very intense community. And many sort of later critics would say that the Taliesin Fellowship becomes a sort of cult of personality and a commune. I think in the early days, it was more optimistic and it was more sort of expansive in how Frank Lloyd Wright could serve as the sort of center of a educational enterprise. He really relied on Olgivanna and her experiences in France, working in a sort of mystic educational enterprise. Olgivanna did the music, the theater, and sort of created the culture of the Taliesin compound, while Wright led its operations in architecture. But what were they actually responding to? What was this rather eclectic group of young men and women out in the farms of Wisconsin? How are they related to larger trends in architecture? Well, the same year that the fellowship opens, Frank Lloyd Wright is invited to exhibit at the Museum of Modern Art. You'll remember from the last weeks, I talked about Philip Johnson and his kind of critique of Frank Lloyd Wright. Philip Johnson at this point is a wealthy Midwestern whippersnapper with a Harvard education, manic depression, and curator position at MoMA. And Philip Johnson just does not like Frank Lloyd Wright. He says, we can't include him in the show, it's only living architects. But there is this feeling, especially by Alfred Barr, that you can't have a show in modern architecture in America without an American. The only American who's working in modern style is Frank Lloyd Wright. And so the show that becomes the sort of seminal didactic, the seminal tool of showing American audiences modern architecture does include Frank Lloyd Wright after a lot of debate. But on the left is the sort of first room with Le Corbusier's Villa Savoy in the center, photographs of Le Corbusier's work. In the back is Frank Lloyd Wright's house, a house on a mesa with photographs of Frank Lloyd Wright's work. And the model that's in the center, which was made by the fellowship, is illustrating a speculative house. Frank Lloyd Wright couldn't admit there's no client here, so various records will say there was a client, but it probably was made just for this exhibit. And while the Europeans, all the sort of French and German architects had submitted housing for workers, housing for middle-class people, Wright reverts to where he's most comfortable. It's a large house, 5 garages, staff. It is a home for an upper middle class family. And Wright sort of says, as his critique of the show, don't you think the wealthy will still want architecture in this bold new future? But he's out of sort of whack. I mean, look at his drawing. It's beautiful colored pencil. It's vines climbing up the building. It is his natural architecture, the same way that Taliesin sort of weaves into the landscape. The same way that his projects in Lake Tahoe are in the desert, we're beginning to connect the architecture in the American landscape he wants to do with this proposal in Colorado. But that really doesn't line up with what is coming in from Europe. And so this is how the house on the mesa is printed in the Museum of Modern Art catalog. And you see Frank Lloyd Wright with this infinite ability to flicker between whatever style you need him to be. On this model, gone are the vines, gone is the context. It's all flat roofs, clean lines, ribbon windows. It looks just like the European modern architecture. And that is Frank Lloyd Wright, the sort of tension that is happening here. And when we look at the work of Gropius, Corbusier, and Mies, the sort of 3 poles of European architecture, all 3 men will immigrate in between the International Modern Show and the start of World War II. All 3 will be working in the United States, except for Le Corbusier. He'll be in France. But Frank Lloyd Wright, for the first time, is really being challenged. He's being critically examined by an institution, by the popular press. He is being put into a historical order in a place that he doesn't like. And since Frank Lloyd Wright had been a part of Louis Sullivan's office in the 1880s, well into the 1920s, Frank Lloyd Wright had self-identified and critically been identified as the forefront of modern architecture. Now he's being overtaken, and this is threatening, this is frightening. These sort of pure white forms, these gleaming metal columns, these ribbon windows, they all made Frank Lloyd Wright look dated and old-fashioned. They made his architecture look traditional, and this is someone who has never been blamed as being traditional. Remember the Chicago housewives who said, what a bizarre building, when they looked past the Roby House. Now, Frank Lloyd Wright would try to stem it with words. That's his favorite way to go. And he called international modernism simply a narrow tributary stemming from my own earlier work. He also said that the work smells of the dissecting room and would have all of us embalmed alive. There is this sort of rejection of this architecture by Frank Lloyd Wright, it's also reflecting his isolationist bent in the sort of social political aspects of Taliesin, where he calls MoMA a predatory internationalist institution, a propagandist who would, like Louis Sullivan blamed the 1893 World's Fair, set architecture back 30 years in America. But it doesn't actually, none of these words matter because Frank Lloyd Wright's still behind. And he's going to have to sharpen his own tools to be able to fight fire with fire, to be able to say, I'm still here and I'm still making American modern architecture. I am not the past. I will be part of the future. And so this forces Wright to clarify his ideas, to publish the books, and to use the fellowship to help create this sort of Frank Lloyd Wright school of thought. After the first 2 winters in Wisconsin, the sort of heating bill alone is making the Wrights reconsider running the school through winter. And so they head down to Arizona. They rent the La Hacienda from a client, Dr. Chandler, and the apprentices work on a speculative project, translating Wright's text of the disappearing city into a model for the Broadacre city. And this will be the basis of next week's lecture when we talk about Wright's suburbanism and house architecture. But this becomes the sort of most intensive exploration of Wright and the apprentices into what the American century is going to look like. What in a post-depression America will our cities expand to? And so you have all the apprentices working with all their tools, making speculative stadiums and farms, hotels, skyscrapers, houses, all the sort of types of buildings at tiny scales, putting them on this giant model. There you see Frank Lloyd Wright sort of pointing about as he controls this scene, and they pack it up in April of 1935 and ship it off to Rockefeller Center. From Rockefeller Center, it will go to Wisconsin, to DC, throughout Pennsylvania and throughout Michigan. And it's really been on display constantly since 1935. The model is now owned by the Museum of Modern Art, and it still is a sort of visionary example of Wright's urbanism and architecture. It is a way that Frank Lloyd Wright is inserting himself into a conversation that he had been overtaken on. Le Corbusier and his machine age modernism was dominating ideas of urban planning. Here we have an American response. And Frank Lloyd Wright has to be on the road talking about it. So 11 days after Broadacre City debuts at Rockefeller Center, Frank Lloyd Wright speaks here at Cranbrook to sold-out crowds at the Cranbrook Pavilion. We don't know much about what he said. He talked about Broadacre City, and the quote that was captured by the Cranbrook secretary was, "Work, work, work, and when you're tired, work." It's a pretty good quote and emblematic of Wright's entire career. What's interesting about the models, and we'll talk more about individual components and how Wright envisioned average Americans living in Broadacre City next week, but the model itself was funded by Edgar J. Kaufman, a Pittsburgh department store magnate who, his son, was a fellow at the Taliesin Fellowship. Now, Edgar Jr. was kicked out by Frank Lloyd Wright because he was gay, but that did not stop Edgar Jr.'s parents, Edgar and Lillian, from still being enamored and sort of dedicated to Frank Lloyd Wright, and they became his most important clients. Not only did the Kaufmans fund Broadacre City, but they commission a summer home south of Pittsburgh, Falling Water. Now, we'll talk again more about this sort of creation of this project in our final lecture, but this image is going to relaunch Frank Lloyd Wright's career. Wright invested an enormous amount of time and energy into the project. At one point, Edgar Kaufman is complaining about the budget being so wildly out of his initial ask, 3 times more than the $70,000 summer home he asked for. And Frank Lloyd Wright says, "My dear, I've given you everything short of suicide. What do you want me to do?" Frank Lloyd Wright really makes this his masterpiece. And I do think that Falling Water is the greatest work of architecture in this country, if not the world of the 20th century. Falling Water does something that Wright's architecture had been itching towards throughout his entire career. It begins to make manifest in architecture a relationship between nature, between building, between time and the senses. It is an architecture that really requires your entire body. I hope that many of you have visited. If you haven't, please go as soon as they reopen for the spring. Because what will happen after you've seen falling water in the flesh is a complete inversion of all of these pictures. You will never be able to see the pictures again the same way because you'll be perplexed about what you experienced not looking like what I am showing you on the screen. You'll also have a sort of Pavlovian response to hearing water every single time you see these pictures, because the most dominant effect of the entire site is this constant and beautiful sound of water running down a fairly steep ravine deep in this valley surrounded by rhododendron and tulip poplars. One of my favorite architects, Paul Rudolph, who's deeply indebted to Frank Lloyd Wright, wrote in 1970 about falling water, "This is a realized dream. It touches something deep within us about which finally none of us can speak." And it is a sort of futile attempt to explain falling water. It is perfection in architecture. You move around across the bridge, down into the valley, closer to the sound of the water, closer to the house. The way that Frank Lloyd Wright balances his masonry, the first time he's used stone in 20 years for a building, balancing it on the left, the masonry of the house, with the right, the natural outcropping, where he has sited the house on top of a sort of triangular boulder and railroad siding. So this little road went up to a railroad stop, and Wright has slipped the house in and then used the materials of a quarry mere feet away to stack up and repeat the natural forms. Then the concrete, which acts sort of like water running between the masonry elements, is tying the house back to the rock ledge and then projecting the house out over the waterfall. You slip in and up and over polished granite or polished stone floors. And then where Wright had in his prairie houses demolished the idea of a room and open sort of pinwheels of space flowing together, but always bound by architectural elements, bound by frame. Here, the boundary is nature itself. The walls have dematerialized to such an extent that it really is the sort of leaves that become the walls. It's the leaves that become the ceiling when you're on the roof deck. Your eye is moving at a diagonal completely across the house out into open space. And if you follow your eye and follow the sound of the water, you'll be looking straight down at the sort of bare run moving through the house. And the whole thing is so magnificently time-based. It's always, there's mist, there's light, there's darkness, there's shadow. There's all these things that are so ephemeral that Frank Lloyd Wright can't control, but are nonstop. You get a sense at Cranbrook, when the fountains are all going, it's so nice that eventually the fountains will turn off. Eventually the architecture will need some sort of change. Falling water, it is relentless. You are always sort of tied to the water. You are tied to the natural site. And physically, like an ocean liner, you can sort of move down in this telescoping stairway. You can walk down to where Frank Lloyd Wright wanted to excavate a plunge pool. Engineers said it was a terrible idea. He puts the plunge pool right next to it. But still, there is this sort of physicality of descending to the water or descending back up into the sort of cozy cove of the dining room. And then you wind your way through these sort of rambling stairways as if you are in a wood, turning this way and that. It has sort of no apparent logic, though formally in plan, we'll see there is a very rigorous sort of planning exercise here. You end up in these bedrooms that are floating, that you feel sort of suspended in the tree line, because the house is built on such a slope that all of your views are looking at the slope on the other side. And so as much as you have the sort of sensation of movement and water, you have a sensation of suspension, that you are floating in space, that the architecture is a tray holding you out and supporting you in nature. You are one with a canopy of trees. You're also in this sort of sense of eternal peril. I mean, the building is sagging from the moment they take the wood out from under the concrete form, and it's been sort of pulled up multiple times over its century of existence. But there is this sort of thrilling tactility to falling water. But what you are missing is the view, the sort of most famous image of Frank Lloyd Wright's work, because this view is completely unrelated to the experience of the house. You have to move through the entire site, move through, up, down, over the house before hiking back across, down, and out on a ledge to actually see this, the finished image. And this is, I think, a very clever and very strange technique. No longer are we presenting our house to our neighbors. We're not presenting the house to a sort of audience. You are creating an experience, a sort of system of space and sound and touch, smell, and then you're given this one chance to have it all solidify, to have it all come together. You understand the house now, but this has been its own pilgrimage, and then you'll go away. And if you're staying at the house, you'll not see this again. If you're leaving, you don't see it again. There is this sort of finality to the image that the experience really makes you wait before you finally get there. It is this kind of magical journey that Frank Lloyd Wright's created. And it's essentially him saying, oh, you want concrete? You want flat roof? You want ribbon windows? Let me show you how to do it. I mean, it is no longer sort of cubic volumes, machines, smooth surfaces. He has taken the sort of aesthetic of the Europeans, particularly Le Corbusier, and he's made it American. He's made it natural. He's made it his own. He's made it, I think, much better, much more beautiful. And it's immediately a sensation. Before it's even opened, it has the first one building show that Museum of Modern Art ever gives. 2 years later, Frank Lloyd Wright will have the first one-man show that the Museum of Modern Art gives to an architect. It is a sensation in the architectural press, as we'll hear more about in week 5. It's part of a series of projects that relaunch Wright's career and bring all of the attention back to him. As Frank Lloyd Wright is working on trying to keep falling water from falling down, he's getting a commission from S.C. Johnson, the wax magnate, who has not suffered in the Depression because of his wax emporium. And much like Frank Lloyd Wright's sort of only early institutional project, the Larkin Soap Company, Johnson Wax is a beautiful administrative internal building within a larger industrial plant. So there's factories around both of these buildings. Here is where management and administration is taking place. Now, Vincent Scully says that the Larkin on the left is the male form, vertical, hard, sort of rough, dominant. And then the Johnson Wax Company is the sort of female form, the womb, the curve, the breast. It is this sort of evolution in style from the Prairie School into something new and modern. Now, we'll remember that the Larkin Administration Building organized management at the base level, and then all of those catalog mail order secretaries are around the edges. At the top are inspirational quotes from the Bible and from Emerson, this sort of romantic maxims written around in gold leaf. And then at lunch, they would have performances, preachers, different sort of theatrics happening to sort of edify the workers in the center. And everyone's sitting on Frank Lloyd Wright designed metal furniture and fireproof cabinets. The whole thing, this sort of factory of work, of paperwork, of processing mail order catalogs in this sort of cathedral of commerce. The Johnson Wax Company is going to be very different. We're going to, instead of kind of entering this great vertical temple, slip in through the horizontals. Notice the way that Frank Lloyd Wright has taken his bricklaying technique from his prairie houses of long Roman brick with raked horizontal mortars, and flush perpins are vertical mortars. So you don't see the vertical break in the brick, you only see the horizontal expanse. And he's now running it around the building. He's running the windows are just plexiglass, Pyrex tubes running around the building. And even when you have a vertical element, Frank Lloyd Wright manages to make it horizontal as well. What he calls these dendriform columns, which, though they are supporting the building, they spread out and become horizontals. Now, there is no context. This is not falling water in a sort of perfect glen of private property. This is a factory town in the middle of the factory complex. And so Wright is going to make us enter through the carport, make us begin to convert ourselves into a totally internal world. He's going to compress us down, the same technique he's used from his houses from the 1890s all the way through the end of his career. We're going to be squished down and then released into one of the world's most beautiful office buildings. And it, like falling water, has a certain feel to it. I don't know if you've had a chance to go to this building. They offer free tours year round. When it opened, it had a concrete floor, a red concrete floor. Now it's carpeted, which makes it even more quiet. So the whole thing just has this hush, this hum of work. Gone are the sort of cling-clang of the metal filing cabinets, and instead you have this sort of, you're not looking at a pond, you are in the pond, you are underwater, and everything is soft, everything is curved, everything is beautiful. This curvaceous sort of womb that's taken you in, now you are sort of existing within this new world, completely separate. You cannot see out of this building, and you are sort of everything, all of your needs are taken care of by the architect. And so he's designed the chairs, the furniture. You can buy these again today. Steelcase is making them. They're not that expensive, and they're sort of super efficient. So instead of having drawers that pop out and have, cluttered backs, the doors pivot on a bar, and so you can see inside the entire drawer. In other desks, he would have file cabinets that move in and out of the desk. The typewriters are integrated, and so there is, again, a sort of efficiency to the operation. But really, it's all about this roof, this structure, why we feel underwater. We are underneath these giant lily pads that go from, I think, 18 feet down to 9 inches. And between them is nothing. It's sort of empty space. How do you get nothing in an architectural form? Pyrex tubes. And so you're in a sort of research building, a building that is all about technology and wax and technology and sort of chemistry. And so he's using the implements of the machine, again, integrating this idea that a building can both convey a feeling, a mood, a texture, an allusion to something, be historically relevant, and incorporate the most modern technology. Why not use silicone adhered Pyrex tubes instead of at the lab bench, above the lab bench, make the entire building this sort of work of technology. Of course, these have failed. They failed almost instantly, but it's about the experiment. And you can make them work now. He's always ahead of the curve, and it's worth it just for the effect. It's worth it to have to add plexiglass domes on top of them to have the interior space. Of course, the building commissioner in town won't approve this structure. He says it's never going to stand up. And so Frank Lloyd Wright invites all of the press out. He invites Mies van der Rohe and students from IIT. He invites his apprentices. He builds a single column, and then he weighs it. It supports the weight of the calculated load of the roof. It supports double that, making the engineers happy. You have some give, and then it keeps going and going until the column finally collapses at something like 10 or 15 times the required weight. And at various times as the experiment is going, the crowd's trailing off. And so Frank Lloyd Wright, who is presenting himself as this, eccentric old man genius, would go up with his cape, his pork pie hat, and his cane, and he'd sort of tap the column, standing underneath the experiment, saying, "I trust this," and then come back out. All of which is sort of it is the sort of beauty of work. It's the dignity of work. It's the idea that you go to work in a place that should be beautiful, that should elevate the spirit. You don't need to be the Kaufmans to have architecture that is ennobling. Why not just be your everyday life in an ennobled, beautiful space? This building, the Herbert Jacobs House, which we'll talk about next week, and Falling Water, are putting Frank Lloyd Wright on the map. Where is he going to build these projects? Where is he designing them? In the winter of 1936, he comes down with a terrible pneumonia. They're not sure that Frank Lloyd Wright will pull through. And that's when Olgivanna makes the choice, we will not do winter in Wisconsin again. In 1937, they go out to the desert to look for property. And on December 30th of 37, Frank Lloyd Wright sends a telegram to his secretary, business manager, and graphic designer, Eugene Masselink. He writes, "Weather warm, beautiful sight in hand. Come soon as you are ready. Bring shovels, rakes, hoes, also hose, 18 drawing boards and tools, wheelbarrows, concrete mixers, a small kohler and wire, oil stoves for cooking and heating, water heater, a viola, cello, and all the rugs not in use." And you see Frank Lloyd Wright, he's found the property, he's bought his spot of the desert. This will be his new winter home, and he is going to start it off right. He's going to have that cello, that viola, and rugs from the very get-go. And before we move on, I mean, Taliesin West is inexplicably hard to document. You know, this is a 75-minute lecture to just walk you through the site. And so it is like all of Wright's houses, does not have that one indelible image. It doesn't have that falling water moment where it clicks. It is a personal expression. It is an experiment. It is rambling. It is a sort of jumbled set of components. And so what I need you to do is actually go and visit it and experience it, because it is an experience more than it is a sort of architectural diagram. The basic layout is you park your car here. There's a spine running out towards the mountains. There's a drafting studio for the apprentices and for their commercial work. There are apartments for the fellows, which are apprentices that don't leave. And then there is the Wrights' own L-shaped house and garden, and then dormitories for the apprentices here. And it would expand many times over the years all the way to today. Olgivanna says that the buildings didn't appear to be being built so much as being excavated, and they really are one with the landscape. Frank Lloyd Wright invents a new technique of taking large desert rubble, putting it into a wooden formwork, and putting a really chunky, slurry mix of concrete on top of it. You let it sort of firm up roughly, and then you open up the formwork and you spray it down to reveal all of those boulders. It is this rubble construction that makes the building literally the same color as the landscape, but also incredibly sort of primitive, almost prehistoric. And so on the right, we see a car pulled up to the encampment about 1938. And here's the entrance as you would see it closer to today, though it has expanded and the suburbs have expanded out to it. And you have this sort of base layer of the heavy masonry. Growing onto it are these almost sort of like C-clamps or paper clips, these wooden elements that link into these prehistoric forms. And on top of that, you then put canvas. And so the building is a really interesting combination of extremely permanent material. Did Frank Lloyd Wright design this, or is it a ruin that he found? Is it a sort of prehistoric indigenous dwelling that they're topping with modern canvas? What is this architecture? It's a unique style. He won't build like this for anyone else. It is a personal expression for the fellowship, for the Wrights. And then on the inside, it is this great sort of open air studio. And you could literally take your drafting tables out into the landscape. He's changed his method of working at this point. He doesn't have employees. He only has the apprentices. They are doing everything, the labor, the cooking, the designing of both the practice and whatever they're sort of designing independently. And there's these incredible photographs by Wright's photographer, Pedro Guerrero, showing the sort of constant activity at Taliesin West, the building of this encampment. And these wonderful sort of eccentric moments where almost like the architecture of a Plains Indian teepee, you have these sort of sticks that overshoot, that they would paint different colors. And they appear to be sort of non-functional, which is fine. It could be ornament. Ornament's a valid expression, right? Never abandons ornament. But in actuality, what he's doing is he's creating a system from which to suspend the building. So the building is sort of flapping open and closed. And the building really is a quite movable system of parts and ever sort of changing based on the climate. And once the rattlesnakes start to come out in the summer, you head back to Wisconsin, you close up the landscape. Now, I'll let you all visit on your own, but just to say that it really is this impossible to photograph experiential architecture that Wright creates, in which he will work for the rest of his career. And it also represents a shift in how he interacts with clients. Wright had always been hesitant to go for a job. He didn't like putting himself out there. He doesn't enter competitions after 1900. He won't go for a job if he knows you're talking to other architects. You need to talk to him or no one else. And oftentimes he'll hear that you're talking to someone else and say, when that doesn't work out, remember Mr. Wright. But he's not going to try and get your work. And he's also not going to visit you. You come to him. You visit him in the garden room at Taliesin West or the living room at Taliesin in Wisconsin. And this is a sort of imperious move. I mean, it fits with his ego that you visit the sort of king in his castle. But I also think it's a self-defense mechanism. He doesn't want a client who doesn't get his work. He doesn't want a client who doesn't understand what they are going to get. And so even though your house, your church, your temple, your civic center, skyscraper, shopping center probably won't look like this, you need to experience in totality a Frank Lloyd Wright building. And if you only know him through pictures, if you only know him through exhibits or his books, you need to come and experience it because he has created an architecture of space and experience. And so you are coming to make sure that you, the client, and Wright, the architect, are going to link up and are going to have a success. And that is why I think there aren't more horror stories of client-architect relationships. Most architects have that one project, like the Farnsworth House in Mies, that just completely collapses. Frank Lloyd Wright doesn't have that. And even with all the leaks, all the budget overruns, most of his clients are deeply happy with the end product. They know what they're getting because they've been here with the architect. And so this Taliesin West becomes the sort of winter seat of the fellowship of the Wrights. It's where they will design the rest of their projects. And it begins to expand on Wright's planning concepts. And almost immediately, commissions like Florida Southern College down in Lakeland reflect this sort of desert mentality, where immediately adjacent to a colonial revival sort of Jeffersonian campus, which Wright doesn't dignify with illustrating, Frank Lloyd Wright takes the sort of orange orchard and puts a series of diagonals of major domes. Instead of Jefferson's dome being a building, it's a water dome, giant water feature. And notice the sort of circular element of the dome, of the library, of the Greek theater at the back, linked together by these enormous covered diagonals, just like Taliesin was linking together components across the desert. So there is a sort of give and take between his experiments at home to his projects for clients. 1938, he's built Taliesin, Fallingwater is under construction, the Johnson Wax is under construction, and he gets a full issue of the Architectural Forum. The first of 3 times he'll have complete control on the design and publication of this America's foremost architectural magazine. This becomes the way that Wright's work is introduced to millions of people. This helps to make Frank Lloyd Wright the dominant figure in American architecture schools and in American homes, and it immediately causes an influx of clients. It causes an influx of lecture invitations. And in 1939, Wright again returns to Europe to give a series of lectures in London, published in a book called An Organic Architecture, The Architecture of Democracy. 2 years later, in 1941, Frank Lloyd Wright will become the 3rd American to win the Royal Institute of British Architects Gold Medal. And he's given that award by King George VI, who also gives him an honorary REBA membership. This is a decade before the American Institute of Architects, which Frank Lloyd Wright never joined, would give Wright his gold medal. Here he is in the middle of war, receiving the highest honor from the British. And Frank Lloyd Wright really is growing in stature. He is expanding his practice. He has his one-man show at the Museum of Modern Art, seen here with Wingspread and another house on the right. And he's continuing to publish. Between 1941 and 1943, he has 3 books that he designs to match. They're all squares. They all have red squares on the front. The first is his collected writings, which were very hard to find prior to this. So it's going back to the late 19th century and up to today. The middle book by Henry Russell Hitchcock, another frenemy at MoMA, is essentially the catalog of the Museum of Modern Art retrospective, and it becomes the first kind of comprehensive look at Wright's career to be published in English. And then a second edition, expanded and revised, of the autobiography. These were years of extreme success for Frank Lloyd Wright. They were years of extreme sort of productivity in the fellowship. Now, World War II would put a hold. Many of his fellows were drafted or enlisted. Some were conscientious objectors and spent the war in prisons. Others got farm deferrals and stayed on at Taliesin, but the entire sort of Wright enterprise is really sort of on hold during World War II as he prepares for this new American kind of architectural movement that will happen in the post-war period. All of this is happening, the 3 books are here, when he gets a letter from Ahila Rebe, who writes to Frank Lloyd Wright in the early summer of 1943. I need a fighter, a lover of space, an originator, a tester and a wise man. Your 3 books, which I am reading now, give me the feeling that no one else will do. I want a temple of spirit, a monument. And Hilla Ribe is asking Frank Lloyd Wright to come and design a museum like no other for the collection that she has assembled for Solomon Guggenheim. Now, Hilla Ribe was born into a minor aristocratic family in Alsace in Imperial Germany. She was artistic and profoundly spiritual, at various times studying theosophy, Buddhism, Zoroastrianism, and astrology. She studied and lived in Cologne, Zurich, and Berlin, and that's where she met Rudolf Bauer, an abstract painter. She moved to New York in 1927 to get away from Bauer and to preach the gospel of non-objective art in the metropolis of tomorrow, as she called New York. She quickly climbed the social ranks of Manhattan, befriending Solomon Guggenheim. Solomon Guggenheim belonged to one of the wealthiest and most influential family in America. His father was a European Jewish immigrant who was a gold, diamond, and copper miner in the US, as well as rubber plantations in South America and Africa. The Guggenheim family had 8 brothers. Solomon was the most sort of head of the family as far as PR and marketing. Solomon was the face of the Guggenheim family. He, with his wife Irene, had houses up and down the East Coast, all traditional and full of Italian old masters. When he meets this slightly mystical woman, Hilla Ribe, he completely changes his collecting habit. She channels his interest to non-objective painting and to people like Kandinsky. Guggenheim becomes the first major collector of Kandinsky in America, and he assembles the greatest collection of this Russian-born, German-practicing artist in America. Now, Ribe is really telling Guggenheim what to do, but Guggenheim is passionate about the work. And when Frank Lloyd Wright is asked to design a museum for this work, he's already on the East Coast, but he doesn't know who Hilla Ribe is, and he actually doesn't know who Guggenheim is. And so he writes back, "Sorry, I can't visit you in New York. You must come to Taliesin. I have to head back for a birthday party." It was his own birthday party, so maybe we'll forgive him. But Hilla Ribe doesn't sort of let go. She writes back, first of all, he said, "Why don't you and your wife come to Taliesin for a weekend?" And she writes back, "I Mrs. Hilla Ribe, and Solomon Guggenheim is one of the wealthiest philanthropists in the world." And Frank Lloyd Wright says, "I'll be right there." And so Frank Lloyd Wright does go to New York, and he inverts his sort of approach, and he will be beholden to Ribe and Guggenheim for this commission. So where exactly were the paintings at this moment? They were in Guggenheim's apartment in the Plaza Hotel. Frank Lloyd Wright would eventually get his own Taliesin East built out in the Plaza Hotel. But here you see the best works of Guggenheim's collection, which Hilla Ribe would bring guest in by public appointment as early as 1931. In 1939, Ribe and Guggenheim opened the Museum of Non-Objective Painting in a used car dealership on the East Side. And it was sort of pleated with gray velour walls, with thick gray carpet, with piped-in classical music and incense burning. It was meant to be a fully immersive experience. And look at where the actual paintings are displayed, really low to the ground, like extraordinarily low to the ground. And this was all part of the sort of cosmic interaction that you were meant to have with non-objective painting, non-figural art. You were meant to have a spiritual encounter and come out a better person on the other side. And so what kind of museum would allow that? This is just a gallery. Ribe knew she did not want the Museum of Modern Art. It's hard to imagine now, but MoMA was pretty much the only really modern building in Manhattan at the time in 1943. Modern architecture up to the 40s was essentially an experimental, ex-urban, and elitist practice. These experimental houses were in Europe or they were in the countryside. MoMA was the kind of one guiding museum modern figure. But this is not what Ribe thought worked for non-objective painting, the sort of sterile white box. She was thinking more about Solomon Guggenheim's niece, Peggy Guggenheim, who had opened the Surrealist Art of this Century gallery in New York, where the paintings are sort of hung in the round along the wall as an experiment. And so Hilla Ribe asked Frank Lloyd Wright to give, quote, "a quiet, peaceful, and elevating sanctuary for those who need a cultural life and whose, by the influence of the paintings, will become leaders of the future." Wright was probably a strange choice because he hated paintings, for one thing. He's kind of indifferent to abstraction more generally. But what he did link with Hilaribe on was being a misunderstood genius. And that's really where they connect. Wright comes to New York, he sees the painting, he rides around with his cousin, Robert Moses, looking for sites, and he says, Mr. Guggenheim, you have to build this in the new Henry Hudson Riverfront Park. And Guggenheim says, no, it's a cultural institution, I need it in Manhattan. And he eventually settles on the site on 89th Street. But before that site was selected, Frank Lloyd Wright has to come up with a design. And this is not how Wright likes to work. He doesn't want to build speculatively, but he knows, okay, it's going to be on a block, it's going to be on a corner. And he eventually warns Ribe and Guggenheim that you may be shocked by what is in my mind when it gets on paper. The whole thing will either throw you off your guard entirely or be just about what you have been dreaming. Anything more modern, less stuffy and conventional you have never seen, nor anything so ideal for your purposes. And his design is this enormous inverted ziggurat. And if we look at this, he has taken a sort of historical form, the Tower of Babylon, the ziggurat or stepped pyramid. He's used a very specific type of ziggurat, not the Mesoamerican ziggurat that he used for the Hollyhock House, but instead the sort of imagined Tower of Babel. But he's turned it on its edge and hollowed it out. And if we look at the bottom of this first drawing, it says ziggurat, then zikkurat, the German word, and then backwards, targets. And it is this sort of verbal analog for the process of flipping the ziggurat and inverting the ziggurat. It's not just he's turning this classic historic form upside down, he's literally opposing the word and running it backward. The sort of arrival at the circle, the spiral as a form, may seem slightly out of nowhere, but it had been percolating up in Wright's career for the last 30 years. As early as 1912, in the essay on the Japanese print that Frank Lloyd Wright had written, he talked about basic geometric shapes as having certain psychic qualities, which we may call the spell power of form. And so he talks about the circle being a sun, a moon, a planet, a cosmic meaning of universality. I mean, this is the type of writing that Hilaribe just loves. So they're sort of on the same page that form, shape can have imbued meaning. And you think about the Midway Gardens, where Wright did his sculptures of a triangle, a square, an octagon, a circle, and the Midway Gardens being his sort of, he's come back from Europe, he's seen non-objective painting, and he begins working in an ornament system of intersecting circles. But we have to make the leap from ornament, from flat decoration, into plan, into building circular buildings. And that happened in 1925 when Wright had designed this proposal for an automobile objective outside of Baltimore and Washington, D.C., where newly freed with your automobile and with new roads, you can take out to the countryside. Where are you going to go? An automobile objective. And it is a sort of double helix on top of the mountain. You drive up it, you cross over a figure eight, and you drive back down it. And the inside is a planetarium, but that doesn't really matter. It's all about the architectural event of being in a car, on a ramp, on the spiral, ziggurat, looking out at the landscape. Wright's architecture was turning towards circles in houses like this project in Los Angeles to be built of plywood, or more sort of exuberantly and strangely in Mexico, where the circle has become a hemisphere and sort of intersecting layered spheres of space in these drawings that don't really tell us much about what the building would be like, but instead reflect Wright's growing confidence of intersecting complex geometries that have no sort of historic precedent. In one of the built circular houses that we'll see next week, again, we get this idea of a ramp spiraling up, the house as a ramp, all of which ties back to Frank Lloyd Wright's love of the car. He had many luxury automobiles. He always had them painted Cherokee red. He would adapt them with canvas roofs. He would black out the back window because he said, I don't look back. And he even designs architecture for vehicles, like a auto showroom in Manhattan, which is a sort of tiny Guggenheim on a little spiral of Mercedes-Benzes spinning around in a pre-existing building. Or here in Detroit, he designs renovations for the Wetmore shop on Woodward Avenue in Ferndale. And this was a little Tudor-Beathan auto shop and garage that Frank Lloyd Wright envisions reshaping as a giant ramp. And so the cars are going up the ramp, and then the showpiece car is sort of projecting out over Woodward Avenue. And those of you who are local to Michigan will know the Wetmore shop. They're still in business. They actually did redo the interior. There is a Frank Lloyd Wright office inside of that building. And the car that is sort of driving out over Woodward Avenue with its wheel spinning is because of this drawing by Frank Lloyd Wright. So we see Frank Lloyd Wright's interest in cars, in ramps, in spirals, and we think about even the Johnson Wax building. What is actually the approach here? There aren't really a lot of people around. It is the car. It is the car moving into the building. It's the building seeming to move. And so his proposals for the siteless Guggenheim are sort of proposing different schemes of this spiral shape. Is it going to be wrapped in copper or marble, painted concrete or mica? Is it going to be gilded? He needs to have a site in order to resolve many of the issues within the 4 different schemes that he shows to Guggenheim and Hilla Uribe. They choose a site in the summer of 1944, and a year later, at the Plaza Hotel, they reveal the Modern Gallery. It's announced as a major PR event. All of the press is there. It is covered in all the newspapers, and Frank Lloyd Wright is sort of standing with his model of a building that he proposed being built out of an expanded steel mesh and then a gun of concrete shot over the mesh in one giant concrete sort of spiral up, a sort of structural system of extreme clarity and beauty, all of it a frame for the art inside. And the inside is really where the spectacular design comes to life. This first proposal in 1945 is taller than the museum would eventually be. It features a stair tower that has a fast ramp, as Wright called it, and then the major ramp of the galleries. Hilla Uribe is not sure that she's gotten what she wants. She actually praises the design as wonderful in of itself and for the embrace between the sky and the earth, but she's concerned it's going to overpower the painting. Notice what's missing from the model: paintings. And so Uribe writes to Wright, while I have no doubt that your building will be a great monument to yourself, I cannot visualize how much or how little it will do for the paintings. We need a monument to painting. That is our interest. She then writes to her friends, and she's sort of panicking, and they say, go with a different architect. But she can't, because Guggenheim at this point is sort of invested in Wright. There's financial investments, and he's American, and she's been told to use an American architect. And so Frank Lloyd Wright takes it upon himself to push the project forward. He's really becomes the sort of the fighter for his design as being perfect for non-objective art. He says that the whole experience begins by slinking into the building, passing a seed pod shaped planter, which you can see in the base of the model, and then going up these hydraulic elevators, which are simply platforms in Pyrex tube shafts. You go up the circular elevator slowly on hydraulics, and then, as Wright said, the elevator did the lifting, the visitor the drifting, and you drift down the spiral. He said that movement through the museum would be like the crest of a curving wave that never breaks. It is this kind of classic architectural motif that goes back to the Greeks and comes all the way to Louis Sullivan of the bud and blossom. We enter the building in a seed pod, we then expand and we flow, we drift through the space, we flower, and then we wilt and exit back to the horrors of Manhattan. Everything is sort of enclosed in this museum: apartments, workshops, theaters, and all of the art is displayed in that very unique way that Uribe believed non-objective art should be, essentially on the ground. And so this is the structural system is folding the wall like this, and then the painting rests here in a little ledge. Of course, what this drawing doesn't show is that the wall is also curved, so there are always sort of technical problems with this idea. But Wright envisions the paintings essentially on the ground, except now he wants no glass and no frames, because the building is the frame. The painting is part of the building. And then it will be illuminated by light coming between the levels of the ramp through Pyrex tubes, artificial light on one side, mirrors on the other, all of which is going to give it this sort of natural light as the sun shifts and moves across the building. And at the top of it will be a Pyrex dome, similar to the one that he designed for the Johnson Wax Research Building a few years earlier. Guggenheim thought the cost of building this project would go down after the war. Instead, it went from a $1 million contract to a $1.5 million and then a $3 million contract as the building got shorter and the program got smaller. Mr. Guggenheim got sick. He was 82 when this project began, and he died in November of 1949 of cancer. He left $2 million for the building, which was less than the contract that he had seen before he passed away. And he left no requirement that Frank Lloyd Wright be the architect. It begins a long series of legal probates and fighting between the Guggenheim heirs and the board and Hilla Ribe. Frank Lloyd Wright keeps up the pace, advocating for his building. But the great sort of sword in the back of this version of the project comes from the New York Times art critic Aline Luschheim, who will become Aline Saarinen, and she completely destroys Hilla Ribe. She takes her to task for her mystic double talk, her doctrinaire attitude, her exclusive addiction to non-objective art. And she says that the Guggenheim, if it ever is built, will only be a small current in the stream of modern art, and that they're being evasive and stalling in the building, and that the Guggenheim is not up to the task and should give its money and collection to the Museum of Modern Art and the Whitney. And with that, Hilla Ribe is out the door, and we get essentially a new client for Frank Lloyd Wright. Now, Frank Lloyd Wright doesn't take this laying down, and he will actually strike up a lifelong friendship with Aline and use her to help promote his revised building. On the site of the building, Frank Lloyd Wright stages 60 Years of Living Architecture, an exhibit that had begun in Philadelphia, traveled throughout Europe, and then came back to New York, where he builds a demonstration Usonian home and a gallery of his work, in which is here the Guggenheim model. When it finally comes back online in 1952, the nephew, Harry Guggenheim, becomes Wright's client, and he gets a much more conventional curator who had come from the Museum of Modern Art and who does not want Frank Lloyd Wright's building, but is not able to fire Frank Lloyd Wright. And you begin to have a tension. Now, most of the time in Frank Lloyd Wright's life, he would just walk away. He would just say, you don't want my house, you want a closet there, you don't have a Frank Lloyd Wright. But he knows that this will be his magnum opus. And so he begins to compromise in the building. The lot gets wider. They get the full frontage on Fifth Avenue. And so it reorients to face Central Park instead of facing the side street. It gets lower to save money. And there's major structural changes because he can't get building permits. It will take 6 years to try and get the New York Department of Buildings to approve it. And this is even with Robert Moses sort of waiving a number of problems with the building. They want emergency exits, emergency stairways. They don't want a glass elevator, but a fireproof elevator. And they want the building to stand up. And so what happens from the proposal in 1945 to 1956 is an important inversion of the ziggurat. Notice in the first plan that the ramp is even going up and out, which means at the top you have a very wide space, a very large dome, and you have essentially a sky terrace, planetarium, a whole world on top of the ziggurat. And the ziggurat is itself just bigger. Structurally, though, the engineers say it's not going to work. And so he has to add it in bracing. He turns it from a sort of ziggurat to what he called the Nautilus shell. And the bracing needs to cant out to keep the building from falling apart. And so the sort of mid-design has a central shaft that is square. Because of building codes, he needs to get the dome smaller. And so finally we arrive at it as built, where the building cants in both directions, which will cause quite a sort of phenomenological effect of the space where you walk into a great ziggurat and then you enter into a room that is narrowing. It does create an enormous kind of architectural mind meld. Finally, ground is broken in 1956. The contractor is bewixed and befuddled, but they press on. They spend all the money and then some, erecting this oddity along Fifth Avenue. And we see Frank Lloyd Wright at his last months of his life on site, living at the Plaza Hotel, managing what will be his magnum opus. Now, Frank Lloyd Wright dies 6 months before the building is complete. Even before it is open, though, it is a sensation. And here you have sketching students photographed by the New York Times before the building has been painted, before it's been open to the public. And just the kind of surrealism of this object that has come and landed down. Intriguingly, Frank Lloyd Wright, the only time he's listed as architect, and he lists his builder, the sort of achievement of actually making this a reality. It opens in October of 1959 with a 4-block line of over 3,000 people. And it opened on a Wednesday at 2 p.m. The press is shocked at how many people want to get in. They're even more shocked when that Sunday, 10,000 people line up to come and go up the elevator and drift down the spiral. It is the most controversial example of a major modern building in a major city and for public use. It is also Frank Lloyd Wright's sort of swan song. And so the critical response of it cannot escape the fact that Wright is now dead. And so this is his magnum opus, opening after his passing. The way it sits in the city is really quite amazing. It only can exist as a contrast. If you had a whole row of Guggenheims, you have no city. You just are sort of stuck in a dreamland. Instead, it breaks the rigor of Manhattan. It sort of exists as an object. It says, I'm special, I'm monumental, come inside. And you slip inside, originally by car, now by foot, compressed down just like all of his architecture, and then released into the main atrium seen here on the opening day of the museum. And then you look up and you are in a world of non-objective architecture, a world of sort of abstraction and space and light. The public response was overwhelmingly positive. The public loved it, still love it. That's why it's in every snow globe in Manhattan. The critical response was much more varied, varying from sort of, well, Frank Lloyd Wright was a genius and here is his temple to himself, to Frank Lloyd Wright was an egomaniac who doesn't know how to design a building. I'm seasick and can't see the paintings. Because you are never on level ground. And so you're floating in space, you're always moving, you're always leaning. And especially with the new curator, Frank Lloyd Wright was fighting. He was fighting, how is it going to be lit? How are the paintings going to be hung? How is it going to sort of be used? Even changing Solomon Guggenheim's gift that it be the Guggenheim collection, permanent collection, to a museum that has shows and rotating exhibits. It was never designed to be that way, so it doesn't work particularly well for it. But it does work well as a social space, as an architectural experience. You go up the ramp, you see the paintings intimately, 9-foot ceilings at most 25 feet back, and then you can turn and you see the paintings from a distance. You also see the movement of people, this kind of symphony of soft feet going up and down and reorienting yourself when you get to planters or the elevator or the little bump out in the room. It is a very unique experience, a very 21st century space. Wright has succeeded in creating a secular cathedral in the city. And when you get to the top, you sort of look back down on this achievement. Now, the art world was not kind. One critic said this was cultural horror, a new disaster inflicted upon art, an architecture totally irrelevant to its purposes, an architecture of only one purpose, attention to itself. Others, though, were a little bit gentler. They said, it doesn't work for looking at these paintings, but it does make us reconsider what a museum is. And that, I think, is Wright's ultimate achievement. Maybe it didn't work for non-objective painting, partly because they would never use the building as he intended, but he has completely changed our ideas about what a museum might be. So on the left is what Frank Lloyd Wright thought would be a permanent collection, paintings leaning like on the easel, illuminated by skylights, sort of light shifting, the paintings never moving. On the right is what you got. Instead of a cream color interior, stark white, the paintings on tripods projecting out into space with their frames attached. The sort of illustration that I love that Frank Lloyd Wright made shortly before his death as he's losing the battle for color, for mounting everything. He knows he's not going to win. I love that he includes this little girl with a yo-yo, because she is the kind of ultimate example that he is not building a museum that we sort of have experienced before. The yo-yo is the sort of metaphor for the spatial continuity. You go up and down, spin around, up and down. But it's also who yo-yos in the Metropolitan or the Louvre. The Guggenheim is something different. This is a place of education, of spirituality, but it's also a sort of social space. It is a great sort of community room. And recently, the Guggenheim remounted the original collection. They didn't do it like Wright wanted, but this is the struggle of the building. It doesn't quite work for that. But Frank Lloyd Wright, in the Hitchcock critique of this museum, he says, here's the swan song of America's greatest architect. And Hitchcock writes that, like the late quartets of Beethoven, like the last works of such long-lived artists as Michelangelo and Titian, The Guggenheim Museum does not belong to the time of its production, but like them, paradoxically, it probably belongs more to the future than to the past. Long after many of the current paintings whose acquisition are the pride of the Guggenheim are retired from exhibition, this building will survive as the triumph of the 20th century. And art changes. Art leaves the canvas, it leaves the idea of frames, it leaves the idea of rectangles, and suddenly the Guggenheim is the museum that it needs to be. It holds conceptual art, it holds displays, it holds non-sort of rectilinear art with enormous dynamism and enormous success. The exhibit that introduced me to this museum that changed the course of my life was when I was 11, I saw the Frank Gehry show at the Guggenheim Museum, which launched my own career in architecture. And here's my ticket stub from that moment. And so there is this sort of effect that the museum has on you. You cannot go into that compression and pop out and release, go up and down the ramp and not come out a changed person. It is an achievement of sort of America's genius architect. It is not just designed to liberate art, it is a sort of form of utopia. The Guggenheim sits in Manhattan, a monument to Frank Lloyd Wright, a monument, a memorial to Solomon Guggenheim, but it also is providing this example of sort of modern architecture par excellence. Thank you, everyone. Now, next week, we'll talk more about Frank Lloyd Wright's urban design, his house architecture, as well as the sort of continuing legacy of his firm. And if you have questions, you can either type them in the chat or you can come up to the podium. And so I'll see you next Tuesday, everyone.